We have right now a World War II veteran, John Benter, up here, and he would like to share a little anecdote with us, a story about the C-47, which is very. Thank you, sir.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Air Museum and everybody connected with it for the grand welcome we had. Neil, my son here, we brought this one M7 tractor out, M2 tractor out here for display, and the welcome has been tremendous. Especially we've met Robin here, somewhere around here. Over there, she's the busiest gal I ever seen. And anyway, every World War II veteran has a story to tell. I've told a few of them, and I remembered another one and when I got here today that has to do with the C-47. And I'd like to just take a minute to tell you what I did in the service, and just take a minute or two till I tell the story about the 747. I graduated from Crosby High School June 11, 1943. 2 days later, I volunteered for the Army. I volunteered for the Air Force. So when I get down to Fort Snelling, there was no room in the Air Force at the time, so they put you wherever they wanted to. So I ended up in the field artillery, which wasn't all that bad. But anyway, the first thing I did, they asked for volunteers one day, and they wanted volunteers for truck drivers. So naturally I signed up. Do you know what we drove? We drove a wheelbarrow in a garden at Fort Snelling. So I was pretty careful after that. I didn't do any volunteering for a while. So anyway, then we went on a troop train from Fort Snelling to California, to Camp Roberts, California. And the troop train, of course, came from Minneapolis and went right through Williston. And my folks had been divorced, and they didn't know I had joined the Army, and my mother lived at Havre, Montana. So around here, when we got past Minot, I got to know one of the conductors. I asked him if he could get off the train when we stopped at the next stop and call my mother and tell her that I had joined the Army and we're coming through on a troop train. And here, a couple, 3 hours later, we got to Havre, and they stopped the train 20 feet from where my mother was standing on the platform. So, it was over 3 years before I ever seen her again. So that was, when you went into World War II, you went into the war, duration of the war in 6 months, whatever it took. So anyway, we got to California and had training in field artillery, and then we took training for amphibious landing, and then we ended up at Angel Island, and that's right by Frisco Bay, and we were there about a week. Every day we marched around the island, which is 5 miles around, got on a lot of KP, peeled a lot of potatoes and all that. But anyway, everything you did in the military mostly was done at night. So in the middle of the night, we get on a ship, the largest ship on the West Coast at that time, the USS Monterey. It was a luxury liner. And so we got on the ship in the middle of the night, and I'm not sure how many days it took to get where we were going, because we didn't know where we were going. So about the first week out, they said, well, you're going to New Guinea. We looked at each other, New Guinea, where's that? What is it? Never heard of New Guinea. So then in the middle of all this here, it probably took about 18 days. We had a 3-day storm, and when we ate, we lined up in the morning we had 2 meals a day, And when you get done with that meal, you start standing in line for the second meal because it took that long to feed 3,000 people. So anyway, there was a 3-day storm, and I was one of the most fortunate ones that never got seasick. And that's a whole nother story in itself if you've seen 3,000 people seasick on a ship. So anyway, we got to Milne Bay, which was the bottom of New Guinea, and they unloaded us in with Army ducks and put us at a base there. And unknowing to us, we were being replaced for casualty replacements. When someone lost their life or was disabled, they would send somebody in there to take their place. And it didn't matter what you were trained for. One of our best cannoneers was trained from Garrison, North Dakota. Bob Parker was his name. He built the Cotton Trail there. But he was a cannoneer, and he got to go back to Australia, and he was MacArthur's office boy to the end of the war. So that's how it went. They just put you where they needed you. So anyway, I always said that in the South Pacific, you had two enemies. One of them, of course, the major one was the Japanese. The second one was the jungle. Because the jungle, it took me at least 6 months where he could get a good night's sleep if you were in a place where he could sleep, to get over all the noise in the jungle, all the bugs and the birds and the screeching, all the animals. And in one respect, it was a good deal because when the birds and all this noise started, you knew somebody was coming. Whether it was friendly or not, you knew somebody was moving around. So anyway, I spent all the spare time I could down at airstrips at Finch Haven, New Guinea. It was the only port on New Guinea that was big enough to bring in big ships right up to the dock and unload them with ammunition, food supplies, and all of that. So then for a while, we would help unload ships, and all this was done in the middle of the night. We would put 12 ton of 105 artillery shells. They were in a tricycle pod wood box, put 12 ton of them on a 6x6 truck, drive out in the jungle through this much mud and unload them. And the truck ahead of me, 3 of them crates fell off and they disappeared in the mud. And of course I stopped, and the sergeant come along and he said, "What in the heck?" He said, "How come you stopped?" And I said, they used a few rough words. And I said, "Well," I said, three of them crates fell off that truck." I said, "I don't want to drive over them." He said, "Drive over them." I sat there a few minutes and I said, "Okay." Of course it didn't go off or I wouldn't be here today. And then next night or two we were unloading 500-pound bombs. And if I'd have known I was going to talk, I'd have brought some notes with me. But anyway, the 500-pound bombs, we put them out in the jungle just to get them in some place where they could pick them up when they were needed. And I said, "Well, how are we going to unload them?" And the guy says, "Well," he said, "you get where you're going to put them, open the tailgate, and put your truck in reverse and get a lot of speed up and set the brakes." And there's 3 big clunks. And once again, they didn't go off, so I thought, well, I was getting educated. so anyway,
Sir. Thank you.
After about a year and a half of that, I got sent down from the northern part of New Guinea to some other base further down, and they flew me down, and I don't remember what kind of airplane it was, but I went down there for chemical training. And on the way back, they said, "We ain't got any airplanes to give you a ride. You'll have to." We spent 2.5 days in a small landing craft getting back to our base. And if you can imagine living on a small landing craft for 2.5 days, well, that's another story too in itself. But anyway, I volunteered for another project. They asked for drivers. They were just coming. They were going to start training for 240 long toms, which was the largest military piece that the Army had, and they had new prime movers, and they asked for volunteers, and they interviewed about 30 of us, and they said, do you know anything about these prime movers? I said, yeah, we knew about them, but we had never even seen one because they were new. So they took us, and so that's what we were training with when the war ended. But getting back, then I ended up, my story about the C-47, I was sent over from Leyte, Tacloban in Leyte, Philippines, to Luzon at Manila, and I got down to the little airstrip on Tacloban, and it was a C-47, and it was all loaded with boxes, and they put me way up on the top, right next to where all the parachutes tied their parachutes to jump. And I was laying on my back, and got ready to go. They got the door shut, and I think all the boxes, it was full of big boxes. I think they were something to do with medical stuff. They started the airplanes, and a weapons carrier drove up, and he drove up right up in front of the airplanes, and he said, the pilot stopped, and he said, this load has got priority, he said. And the pilot said they went into a big argument. He said, we're overloaded now. And the weapons carrier guy, he said, well, this has to go. They shut the engines off, and we helped unload that 2/3 of that load on that C-47, rearranged it all. And then I was way up on the top there, I was laying on my back, and I could just see the windows down on the side of the airplane. And the landing strip, or the airport strip, went out over the runway, or the ocean. And when we took off, I looked down, and all the windows got wet from the water. We were that close to the ocean. And it was only about a 2-hour ride to Manila. And we landed, and the ground crew came out, and the pilot said, you got to put me on a new engine on the left side. He said, it burns too much oil. And the guy says, oh, he said, we haven't got an engine, we'll just give you a barrel of oil. So anyway, about a couple of months after that, the war ended, and things were getting back to normal. And on the way back on the ship, we were on a different cargo ship, and we hit another storm, and I got sick. I didn't get sick on the way over, but I did. And I told him, I said, take me back to the Philippines. I said, rather than finish this trip on this storm. Oh, no, said, you're going back to the U.S., so that's fine. But we landed in Frisco in the middle of the night, and the greatest moment of my life, when we were about 3 miles out from under the Golden Gate Bridge, I realized the war had ended. And I cried for hours, really. So then, of course, I was looking forward to a good meal that night, and they unloaded us in the middle of the night, went to a mess hall, and it was all run by young German prisoners that had been taken when the war started in South Africa, and they had been there for 4 or 5 years, living like kings, after we had come back from the South Pacific, where the Japanese treated our prisoners. I was in Manila right when they, 2 days after they took all the prisoners out of there, and seen how they were treated, and how we treated the prisoners from Africa. So I never ate that night. I couldn't eat. So anyway, that's my story about the C-47. So there's no water around here, so windows won't get wet anyway. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, John.